Yes! Thank you, everybody, for tuning in to another episode of the Keeping Karlsson Fantasy Hockey Podcast, the best fantasy hockey podcast in the world, hosted by two guys who own Erik Karlsson in their keeper pools. I'm your host, Elon Dubrovsky, and with me is the guy who spent the last 72 hours tiering his goalies, Brian Kalm.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Elon. I don't know if that's an understatement or an overstatement. I've been thinking about this regularly now for like at least a month, but intensely, and including a very detailed spreadsheet for the last 72 hours for sure. Elon, before we get to the show, I need to stand up to do this just to show what I've got on.
Hey, sweet digs.
We've got some pretty cool threads happening on the show this week, courtesy of one of our patrons, Ryan, sent them over.
Yeah, Puck Tees is his site. You could get cool shirts like this, World Cup themed. I really like them. Check it out.
I have to say, this t-shirt is like, I mean, the World Cup has been fun, but this is legitimately the most exciting part of the World Cup for me to this point. I've looked more at the players on my t-shirt than I have caught coverage of the World Cup so far, but maybe once the actual tournament starts, they stop playing all these meaningless exhibition games, that'll change.
All right, Brian. Thank you, Ryan, for sending those shirts. And now I want to say, this is not just a regular episode of Keeping Karlsson. This is Smörgoåliesbord 2016, third annual Smörgoåliesbord. I actually spent the weekend listening to the last two Smörgoåliesbord to get caught up on where we were last year and 2 years ago. And I'm very excited for this episode. It's not a typical episode. We're not going to be going super deep into like all the players that we discussed, because we're going to be talking about every single goalie in the NHL pretty much for next season and how we think they rank, how we think you should tier them. We'll get to all that in just a minute. But first, let me mention that we are presented by DobberHockey.com, the best fantasy hockey website out there. If you haven't done your draft yet, it is not too late to get the Dobber Hockey Guide. It has all the information you need to help you when you're drafting. You've got all of his projections. You could even get the combo of the guide and Fantasy Hockey Geek, which will help you decide player values based specifically on your league's categories. It's great. Check it out, DobberHockey.com.
Yeah, DobberHockey.com has a lot. And you know what Dobber Hockey does also, Elon? Dobber Hockey is actually, I got to confess, it's one of the places where I first got the idea to start tiering my players going into fantasy drafts. I'm going to say that again because I think I was making noise. Tiering my players to prepare for my fantasy drafts. And one big part of that is tiering goalies. For me, that's actually the most fun to tier, because there really are, there's a finite amount of goalies available, and tiering them precisely is a really important key to succeeding in your draft. So we're going to go into our goalie tiers on this episode. Elon, first, why do we even tier?
Okay, so it's like what and why, right? So when we say tiering goalies, I mean, we're going to be splitting goalies into, I guess, just groups like tier 1, tier 2. And we're saying all the goalies in a particular tier, we're considering their value pretty much equal. And the reason why we want to do that and get these different groups is when you're drafting, and this doesn't matter if it's an auction draft or a snake draft, you've got to kind of keep track of, like, in the tier that there's still goalies remaining, how many goalies are there remaining? So for example, let's say you have 8 goalies in your second tier. All the tier 1 guys are gone. You have 8 goalies in your second tier. It's time for your pick. Do you need to pick a goalie right now? Maybe not. You're probably going to have one of those tier 2 goalies left for your next pick. And if you assume all these guys are pretty much equal, might as well wait. Get a higher ranked forward. But on the other hand, if you're down to just like 1 or 2 goalies in your highest tier, then you kind of really got to grab a goalie, because that means that if you don't take that goalie now, then your next pick, you're going to get someone in a whole other tier, and that means they have a whole different value for you. So it's very important. You really need to do this for all positions, but goalie especially, because goalie is so important in fantasy hockey. Usually leagues like the Cupful, the Keeping Karlsson Ultimate Patron Fantrax League, we've got 8 categories. 3 of them are goalies. So if you don't have good goalies, it's going to be very hard for you to win your matchups. So that's what we're going to talk about today. All of our goalie tiers. Brian, I know you've made yours. I've made mine. Yours are definitely more well-researched, but I'll still have fun comparing and telling you where I disagree. But why don't you go ahead and explain how you went about tiering your goalies?
Sure. So for this edition of Smörgoåliesbord, and every year, I try and add a little something new into it, and I'll get to that. But the basics are, there's 3 main considerations when I'm making my tiers. The first one is a goalie's role. So are they a straight up number 1? Are they sharing time as a number 1, but maybe a 1A guy? Are they a number Are they a 1B guy, or are they a number 2, a number 2 who has room to challenge? There's a lot of things that go in, but role and room for potential in that role. So room to challenge is also a consideration. That's the first one.
Okay.
The second... Oh.
Well, yeah, it's very important. If you draft a goalie, especially like your top goalie, you want to be able to trust that he's going to play a lot of games and help you in your matchups. There's no point having Brian Elliott last year, back when Jake Allen was getting all of the starts. It's like, great, Jake Allen is doing everything, and Brian Elliott's just sitting on my bench. So yeah, you want to have a goalie that you're going to be confident has a strong role on his team, for sure. What's number 2?
The second one is team strength. As we talked about on the bonus episode with Nick Mercadante just a few days ago, a team has a huge impact on their goalie. So a goalie who plays for the best team in the league and gets traded to the worst team in the league, they might be the same goalie, but their numbers are going to change significantly. And that's because, goalies don't score goals. They can't get the win all by themselves. Even if they have a stellar night, it's not entirely up to them night in, night out. So what the guys in front of them are doing both offensively and defensively are important things to consider.
Yeah, definitely. And pretty much every fantasy league has wins as a category. So even if you have like the best goalie that's going to help you in save percentage, if their team sucks, they're not going to get you many wins. So yeah, you want to have a goalie that's on a good team. That's the best, right? If you can have a good goalie on a good team. And I guess that gets to your third consideration, right? How good is this goalie in the first place?
Yeah, so we've got role, we've got team strength, and I rounded out with talent. And that's something, a lot of us have different ways to measure how good a goalie is. The ways that I have chosen to measure my goalies the most this year, even strength save percentage and Mercad per 60 minutes, which for those who might not have gotten a chance yet to listen to the last episode, is essentially a way of determining how a goalie fares compared to the average goalie depending on the shot location. So what it does is it takes shot location, or if you want to call it shot quality, into effect, decides how much of those shots a goalie should have stopped, and then measures whether a certain goalie stopped more than he should have or less than he should have. So a good Mercad per 60 minutes indicates a goalie who would outperform most of his peers who were in that net facing the exact same shots.
Okay, so we've got our 3 sort of considerations now: team strength, talent, and role on the team. I think, Brian, it's time for you to define, how are you going to define the top tier? Like, who are the best goalies? But before we get to who are the best goalies, what would you consider to be a goalie in the top tier? What do they need to do in these 3 dimensions?
So they need to be number 1. In fact, our first 3 tiers straight up, number 1 goalies. If you're not a number 1, if you're not a guaranteed number 1, I'm sorry, there's no room for you in the top 3 tiers. So tier 1, you got to be a number 1 goalie. The second part is that you have to either be really awesome yourself or be on an awesome team. And whichever one you're awesome at, the other one needs to be above average too. So I hope I'm articulating this well enough. It's like number 1 starter and somebody who is one part awesome and other part above average when looking at my 2 other considerations of team strength and talent.
Okay, so you basically need to be awesome at all 3 of your dimensions. One of them you're allowed to just be above average. All right, give it to us, Brian. Who is in the top tier of goalies for this season? We have a message in the chat here. Matthew is saying that Brian will probably have Mason in tier 1. I wouldn't be surprised. Brian loves Steve Mason. Is he there, Brian?
He's not there, but I'm pretty sure I still have him higher than you. We'll have to see when the time comes. My number 1 guy in my number 1 tier, and usually I don't say that, it's usually just the first tier because that's the whole point of tiering, but I almost considered creating an entire tier for Braden Holtby this year. He is the guy that stands head and shoulders above the rest, and it's not necessarily because he's a lights out save percentage guy. If you look at his 3-year even strength save percentage, he's actually in the 8 to 10 range, but the thing is that he's the only guy in that 8 to 10 range without another issue to worry about. So he's proven his mettle over the course of the last 3 years consistently, and he's not getting too old. His team isn't declining. He doesn't have a significant part on the defense in front of him leaving this year. And, so he has none of that negative stuff. And then he has an amazing and a well-coached team in front of him, which I can't say necessarily is the case for any of the next 3 guys. So that's why Braden Holtby is the guy who has the highest even strength save percentage over the last several years without any major issues on the horizon, is the one who stands alone above the rest in tier 1, but it still is in tier 1. It's worth pointing out.
Okay, so Braden Holtby for sure. Everyone knows he's an elite fantasy hockey goalie option. You're saying the best option. We're putting him in tier 1. And you say he's not among the very top in even strength save percentage. And by the way, we should probably mention you're talking about even strength save percentage, even though most leagues don't have that as a stat or a category. It's usually just regular save percentage. But I know you use even strength save percentage because that's more predictive of how a goalie will do next year. Maybe you could get more into that in a little bit. But just looking at regular save percentage, Holtby had a 922 last year. So definitely well above average if we consider an average save percentage around like 915 or 916. So maybe he wasn't like the top in save percentage, but he was definitely very high. And then, like you said, such a great team, 48 wins last year. I don't know if he'll get 48 again, but definitely should be well above 40. Yeah, it's a great situation. Like, who is even the backup in Washington? Does anyone know? It's Grubauer. No, it's not him. I don't even know. Who is it?
Grubauer.
It's Grubauer. I knew that.
It was Grubauer or Justin Peters heading into camp last year. A little bit of trivia there for you.
Yeah, we'll see where we tier Grubauer on this list. Yeah, okay, so Holtby's amazing. You decided not to put him in a tier on his own, so let's talk about who else. We don't need to say anymore. Like, if you could get Holtby, you're set. Who else is in tier 1?
The other two goalies in tier 1 are Ben Bishop and Carey Price. That's it. I have 3 goalies in tier 1. You'll notice some names missing that have been tier 1 mainstays, and we'll get to them in the later tiers. But for now, Holtby, Bishop, Price makes up my top tier. As for Bishop, he's a top 10 guy last year in even strength save percentage, but he's also the same as Braden Holtby above in that, he's got a very good team in front of him. It's pretty well coached. There's no significant departures in Tampa that will hurt him. He's just a little lower in even strength save percentage over the last few years than Holtby was, and that's why I made that division between the two. And then Carey Price, far and away, he is the 3-year even strength save percentage leader by 4 points, by 4 save percentage points. That's like a 938 to a 934. And just for some context, the next biggest difference in like the top 50 goalies, probably and beyond, is less than 2 points, and most goalies are separated by about a half a point. Carey Price has separated himself from the top of the pack by 8 times that much, and that is why he's all the way up there. Unfortunately, Montreal is coached by Michel Therrien and has some suspect roster issues that I expect them to be dealing with. There's also that injury still hovering over us. I'm over it. I don't know if the rest of your poolies are, though. So maybe you'll be able to snag him a little later than usual because others are worried about it. I'm personally not, which is why he still gets to tier 1 based on his incredible superhuman even strength performance over the last 3 years.
Okay, so very interesting. It's interesting who you have in there. It's also interesting who you don't have in there. So first of all, who you do have in there, Ben Bishop is interesting. His situation, we talked about this last year on Smörgoåliesbord. Like, how good is it? Because everyone knows that Vasilevsky is a strong prospect in hockey. I don't even know if you could call him a prospect anymore. A lot of people think he's going to take over the Tampa net, and especially with expansion coming up, people are wondering if Bishop is even going to remain with the team all throughout the season or if they're going to trade him. I'm just wondering what you think about him in terms of his role on the team. Obviously, he's the number 1 going in, but do you think it's as strong as Holtby? I would say it's not as strong as Holtby, right?
I wouldn't say it's quite as strong as Holtby. If one of those 3 guys is going to somehow lose their starting job this season, it'll be Bishop, except I don't think it's going to come down to that. Maybe he's a guy at the trade deadline if he's been, so-so through the first chunk of the season and Vasilevsky has impressed in the time that he's shown up. In that case, maybe he gets moved somewhere else and his value likely goes down because there aren't a ton of teams as good as Tampa. But the thing with Vasilevsky is he didn't get in a lot of games last year at all, and he wasn't overly impressive in those games either. Of course, there was, he had a few flashes of brilliance in the playoffs when Bishop was down due to injury, and that would be another slight concern about Bishop, was that he played through a pretty rough injury for the last few weeks of that playoff run that he was a part of. And that would be my sort of concern with him, except I haven't heard anything else about it at this point, and I'm trying to put it behind me. But I would probably say the thing is that Tampa is so good, or so much better than Montreal, in my opinion, that I can't necessarily put him below Price in that top tier, just because just because Price is so much better. I feel like all those factors sort of even out to make them about equally desirable options.
Okay, yeah. Ben Bishop, by the way, 926 save percentage last year. I know you were referencing the last 3 years even strength save percentage and saying Holtby was a bit higher, but if we just look at regular save percentage last year, Bishop actually had the edge, though of course Carey Price blew them both out of the water.
So Elon, how we doing? Those are my 3 top tier guys. How many did you have in your top tier?
So I had one more guy there, and I'll admit it was tough to decide if he should go in tier 1 or tier 2, and I know that you disagree with me. I remember listening, by the way, to Smörgoåliesbord last year. I just listened to it today, and at one point in the episode, we were talking about like our 4th tiers or something, and I put a guy in my 3rd tier, and you scoffed at me so much. I said, I think Martin Jones would be a really great second goalie on your team, and you were like, really? Really? Martin Jones, the guy who only had a 908 save percentage the year before? And then I was like, well, he was pretty good on LA, except for maybe not that year, but the year before he was good. And now he was being taken as San Jose's number 1. And you know what? Martin Jones came into San Jose and defied maybe a lot of people's expectations, definitely defied your expectations. He owned that number 1 job, took the team all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals. He only had a 918 save percentage, which I'm sure you're going to bring up as a reason why maybe you didn't put him in your top tier. He doesn't have that same over 920 that the other 3 guys have, but 37 wins on the year, which put him 3rd in the league. And I don't know, I guess maybe I'm also biased a little bit by San Jose going to the Cup Finals, which is maybe dumb. So tell me why you don't have Martin Jones in your top tier.
Okay, so initially, you know what, before like 6 hours ago, I was ready to be like, okay, Martin Jones, top tier. I can put him with Bishop, say, as somebody who's a pretty good goalie and is on a very good team that will definitely make up for that, for any trouble he'll give you in his own personal numbers, like save percentage. But then I took a closer look at exactly what Martin Jones did last year, and it wasn't very good. He was ranked 22nd in the league in even strength save percentage amongst starters. And if we remember, like, he was up and down. Elon, I remember when you told me about Smörgoåliesbord last year and how I wasn't as high on him as I was, or as you were.
And as you should have been.
Yeah, as you think I should have been. I remember it was an ongoing debate over the start of the season because he started off hot, and then he was cold, and then he was hot. And that inconsistency ended up being that he didn't have 2 solid months, which is essentially 2 solid 10-game stretches consecutively till February. So if you're looking for somebody that you think has really proven his mettle as an NHL starter, I don't know that Martin Jones is that guy. Now, San Jose is going to be able to mask a lot of things that might be wrong with Martin Jones's game. They're going to be one of the better teams in the NHL this year in my own projections. But we're making decisions here off of 35 games from January to March, say, where he was lights out, like mid 920s, all situation save percentage, which is fantastic. But to me, that's not enough in my books to be up there in the top tier with somebody who has a very good even strength save percentage and plays for a very good team. He's only got half of that.
Okay, I think that's fair. And now that I look at some of the guys that I have in my tier 2, I would say Jones probably belongs with them more than he belongs with guys like Holtby and Price, and I guess Ben Bishop. Ben Bishop, I don't know. I'm not sure about Ben Bishop. Like, I know he did so well. It's hard, but okay, we've got to sort of move on from our top tier. I'm sure that, like, Bishop had an amazing year last year. Tampa's a great team. You're probably right that Bishop's going to get most of the starts. I'm just concerned about him like getting traded halfway through. Hopefully he'd be traded to a team that's a contender, like maybe to Dallas or something. Maybe that could be just as good for him. But okay, so there's our top tiers, and there's one name so conspicuously absent, right? Because in last 2 Smörgoåliesbord, there was a guy that we both had there, and it was like not even a question. It was like for sure this guy's in the top tier. This year, we didn't have him. Henrik Lundqvist. I feel like we have to address him right now. Why is he outside of your top tier for the first time, probably in like 10 years of fantasy hockey, if people have been playing that long, that Henrik Lundqvist isn't in the top tier of goalies to draft next year?
Well, I'm going to tell you straight up, it wasn't necessarily based on last year's performance. He was fantastic. He had a 920 save percentage, which was his, I'm trying to count now, 7th or 8th consecutive year, putting up a 920 or higher. Like in that span, he hasn't gone lower than 920, which is just an incredible achievement, especially at his age. And he ranked very high. He was 3rd in the league in even strength save percentage amongst starting goalies, only behind 2 guys who didn't play as much as him, and was 1st in Mercad per 60. So a lot of really good things to like about Lundqvist, except his age. He's getting older. And one thing that I feel like we found from him over the last several years is that there are more and more stretches of inconsistency from Lundqvist. If you go month by month save percentage, so spans of about 10 games, here's how it looks last year. 943 to start the season, then a 929, then an 892, then 922 and 934, 2 good months, and then back down to a 906 and an 895 in 4 games in April to end the season. And those will hurt you in a head-to-head league. If you're in Roto, maybe you can take that hit. But if you're in a head-to-head league, that's sort of those lulls that he's starting to get into are going to hurt you pretty hard, especially if you're in like a really heated matchup. And towards the end of the year was a point where Lundqvist fell off. So it's not that his numbers were bad. It's just that they weren't as consistent as we've come to expect from him. And I don't expect he's going to be any more consistent in the years to come. He still has a difficult Rangers D-core to contend with. And there's just that aging curve as well to keep in mind. So for those reasons, I feel very badly about this. I truly do, especially because last year, again, by all statistical measures, incredible season from Henrik Lundqvist. But from a fantasy perspective, he's just not as reliable week in, week out as he used to be.
Okay, well, and also, even if we wanted to say he still is an amazing goalie, which I'm sure he is, like you say, there are some red flags with the age and the maybe slight inconsistencies, but also we define the top tier as being a goalie in the number one role. Okay, check for Henrik Lundqvist for sure. A great goalie. Okay, check. Let's give him that. But we also said you have to have at least an above average team. I'm not sure. Are the Rangers an above average team at this point? Like, how many wins is he going to get? Like, last year, he was still able to pick up 35 wins, which is good. Like, that was around 7th. He actually tied for 4th with like 4 other goalies for wins with 35, actually with 5 other goalies. So a lot of goalies were there. So, but this year, I don't know. Now they've lost a defense in Yandel. We've already talked a lot about what's been going on the Rangers. Just when you look at their depth chart, to me, it just looks a little thin, especially on defense, which means he's really going to have to stand on his head. And I just don't know if I would consider the Rangers a good enough team for next season to put Lundqvist in my top tier. So that's the main reason why I'm putting him in my tier 2. At the top of my tier 2, but I would definitely consider him the next tier right along with Martin Jones.
I agree, Elon. It's going to be an uphill climb. Maybe that's a little dramatic, but that's just my gut feeling for him to get to those 35 wins again. And my dream for Henrik Lundqvist this year is that they use Antti Raanta as a regular backup for him so that he gets rest during these periods where he's going to be anyway, and he can just use those rest periods to regenerate and get better and come in and be strong again.
Okay, so, it's hard. We're going to have a bunch of tiers here. We got to make a cutoff. So, now we've got our top tier. We're into our second tier. So in our second tier, now we're saying all these guys we consider to be pretty much in the same group. So far, I had Jones, I think, in my top tier, but I think I'm going to move him to my second tier as well. So we both have Jones and Lundqvist in our second tiers. Who else rounds out tier 2 for you?
All right, I'll tell you, I have 4 more guys in tier 2. So there's 6 in all in my second tier. And I'll go through them quickly. We have Roberto Luongo, who is higher ranked last year in even strength save percentage than he is in Mercad per 60. And that's actually the case both last year and over the last 3 years, which makes me wonder, and I'm not sure if I'm reading this 100% right, but the inference that I'm making from it is that a decrease in the quality of defense he's seeing in front of him is going to be more reflected in his save percentage if he's performing not as well relatively based on the shot locations that he's getting. I'm not sure if I'm making sense here, but what I'm trying to say is that I feel like he's susceptible to a breakdown in defense ahead of him. And I think I've mentioned at least weekly that the Panthers have lost to Brian Campbell, who was a really great presence on that back end. The rest of the team is still growing and can step up. They've added Yandel, they've added Demers, so those are both positive things. Maybe that'll help steady, but Luongo is also battling age. You wouldn't believe how old the guy is. Like we talked about it last episode on the bonus show. He is going to be like 38. I don't have it in front of me next season. So that's another reason to be concerned. So you've got Luongo in that tier. You've also got Corey Crawford in the second tier, who is, I think, underappreciated. I always had him in my mind as somebody who got to be like the Chris Osgood of the Chicago Blackhawks Cup runs. He was just the beneficiary of a great team in front of him. But his Mercad per 60 indicates that he's not just a pedestrian average goalie. He's ranked 4th in Mercad per 60 over the last 3 years and 7th in even strength save percentage over the last 3 years. He had a solid year last season. He's contending with a bit of a thinning out team in front of him. And the Blackhawks continue to rely on Brent Seabrook, which is really going to catch up with them someday. That's why Crawford is in tier 2 as a goalie who has been very good over the last few years, but I'm not sure exactly how well Chicago does, if they're going to do well enough for me to justify bumping him into that top tier. My last 2 guys in my second tier, Corey Schneider, who's a top 10 goalie, top 5 in Mercad per 60, and he's better than every other guy in his tier in even strength save percentage and including in the top tier, but he is on a significantly worse team than a lot of them. So his individual talent, for me, makes up that difference. So you can draft him, expect great save percentage, and hope that New Jersey can rattle off some wins over the course of the season. And finally, the last guy, Jonathan Quick, who's like the inverse of Corey Schneider. He's not a top 10 guy in any way. He was 17th among starters in 5-on-5 save percentage in the last 3 years, but he plays for a team that knows how to play a very effective defensive system in LA, and that's enough for me to regard him a little bit higher than the rest of the goalies that are to come in tier 3.
Okay, so why don't you just recap now? So who did you have in your tier 2? You had, or I have it here: Jones, Luongo, Lundqvist, Crawford, Schneider, and Quick. Not necessarily in that order, but those are your tier 2 guys. Okay, I got a lot of comments here, Brian.
Bring them on.
Okay, so first of all, let's talk about who you do have there. I have a thought about Roberto Luongo. So maybe before we get into it, how exactly did you define this tier 2?
So tier 2 was number 1 goalies with 2 parts above average between team strength and talent.
Okay, so maybe this is my problem every year, and I know I got burned a little bit by this last year when I was concerned about Scott Darling stealing starts from Corey Crawford, and that didn't end up happening. I was wrong about that, and I feel especially bad because I ended up drafting Corey Crawford as my second goalie in the cupful, and I fear that maybe it was because of me being concerned about him on the podcast that people didn't draft him. I was able to get him so low, and then he ended up helping me a lot, got me to the finals. So I'm sorry about that. I promise it wasn't like a con or anything, but I'm a little bit concerned about Roberto Luongo there. I'm not sure if he's the for sure 100% like number 1 who's going to get a high number of games. Like I'm sure he's going to still get more games than James Reimer, but Reimer was really good on the Leafs when he was healthy. And also Luongo has his injury issues himself. And also Luongo, like you say, is getting older. I just feel like I don't know how many games I could trust him for if I was going to have him as my number 1 goalie, especially in tier 2 when we're comparing him to all these other guys, like putting him in the same tier as Lundqvist. I don't know. I just worry that maybe he's not as entrenched as a number 1 as the other guys you mentioned.
Fair enough. And nobody's been a bigger backer of James Reimer over the last little while than I have been. And interestingly enough, he led all goalies last year in even strength save percentage. Not so in Mercad per 60, although he still was like 6th, so that's pretty good. He also played only 40 games, so it might be a small sample. Like if you look over the last 3 years, he's somewhere in the 20s in even strength save percentage, lower in Mercad per 60. So, I believe in James Reimer, but at the same time, I don't know that he can steal more than, say, 30 games away from Luongo this year, although I think the Panthers have a very brightly managed team right now, and I feel like there's definitely conversations about the best way to use James Reimer to spell Roberto Luongo so that he is as good in all his starts as he can be, and he doesn't fall off as sharply and awfully as he did at the end of last season.
Okay, so yeah, for me, I have Luongo in my tier 3, and obviously I'm being affected by what you're saying here, so doesn't matter what I say, but I'll just tell you, I also had 2 guys in my tier 2 that you don't have there, and I'm curious to know why you don't have them there, so I guess we're sort of going to be blending tiers 2 and 3. I had Devin Dubnyk in the list. I see him as a guy on an above-average team, and he's an above-average goalie, so I feel that sort of fits your definition. He's an entrenched number 1. No way Darcy Kemper assuming he's still on the team. I think he is. I don't know. No way Darcy Kemper steals a lot of starts from Dubnyk. And also, I feel like, yeah, he's a great goalie. Maybe not like one of the top, not like 2 years ago when he sort of ran away with being the top goalie for the second half of the season, but he's definitely above average. Like last season, he ended up with a .918 save percentage. Okay, a little bit above average maybe. And also I think Minnesota is a decent team, and maybe some of their players are aging, but I still think they're a playoff team. So that's why I had Devan Dubnyk there.
That's fair. I think last year the lesson we learned about Devan Dubnyk was that he's not a 921 is that he's not a 929 goalie. Remember 2 years ago when he showed up with Minnesota and was incredible, unbeatable when he was acquired by them and getting to start every game, and a really great relief from the inconsistencies that Nicholas Backstrom and Darcy Kemper had offered in net prior to him. And a lot of people were like, this is the arrival of Devan Dubnyk. He's going to be a 925 or higher goalie for the rest of his career. And well, it wasn't true. And I still think that the effects of that are still in play when people might be ranking their goalie tiers. I mean, he was very good last year. He was a top 10 goalie in even strength save percentage over the last 3 years, in large part on the strength of those huge games in Minnesota where he was a brick wall. He's a top 15 guy, but his Mercat per 60 is a little bit lower, which suggests that he's not like an average goalie. There are several other goalies in the league who might have been able to stop more of the shots that he faced in his scenario. So, I mean, I want to agree with you. I want to give you Devan Dubnyk, but I think he's a lot more similar to my other tier 3 guys than he is my tier 2 guys.
Right, and that's fair. And at the end of the day, we need to split these guys up in a reasonable way so that we can decide for our drafting strategy. And you're going to sort of also, at the end of the day, you have to sort of go with your gut a little bit and have to feel like, who are you more comfortable with? And you're saying you like Dubnyk more along your tier 3 guys. That's fair. The other guy who I put in tier 2, which I know you're going to scoff a little bit, but I have a feeling, and so bear with me. And a lot of people, by the way, in the chat room have been guessing people that they think are going to be in your tier 2. And so maybe they're surprised that Pekka Rinne wasn't there. I'm seeing some people guessed him. I saw a guess for Talbot. I see a guess for Tuukka Rask. You didn't have any of those guys, and that's actually none of those guys are the ones that I'm thinking of that I put into my tier 2. So maybe this is a bit of a shocker. Maybe you'll tell me I'm dumb, but I think I have Jake Allen in there. And like, hear me out. He is now the #1 goalie on St. Louis. No more Brian Elliott to worry about. Like, he's going to get a ton of starts. I think St. Louis is an amazing team. Like, they're more than an above average team. I would consider them one of the top teams in the league. So now we've got entrenched #1 on an awesome team. And he's not a bad goalie. Like last year, he had a .920 save percentage. Maybe you could go more into like the even strength and the Mercat per 60. But I guess I'll need you to convince me why Jake Allen doesn't belong there at this point.
Yeah, so his raw save percentage definitely put him in a better position than his other numbers did. If you look at his adjusted goals saved above average, which is same as Mercat per 60, by the way, of just Mercat per 60 is easier to say and credits the creator, only to be fair. And the save percentage rank and the even strength and his even strength save percentage rank, they show him to be like a very middle of the road goalie. And he's been blessed with really great protection in St. Louis, and he hasn't been able to take advantage of it. I think 2 years ago was his chance to get out ahead of Brian Elliott. I feel like they wanted him to take the reins, and he couldn't. And I don't think Brian Elliott is a very incredible goalie. And the fact that Jake Allen has not, over 2 seasons, been able to take the reins from him speaks to what I imagine his talent to be. I think he's going to benefit still from the Ken Hitchcock defended St. Louis Blues decor, and he's still going to get wins thanks to a very strong offense in St. Louis. But I don't think he himself personally necessarily has the talent required for me to get to tier 2. But Elon, both the guys you mentioned, Dubnyk and Allen, are in my tier 3.
All right, so then let's go to that then. Let's get into your tier 3. We already know that Dubnyk and Allen are there. How about these other guys that I mentioned that the patrons were guessing? Do they get into the list as well? And I'm sorry, I said the patrons. I mean the people in the chat room, many of whom are patrons of Keeping Karlsson.
Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of names in the chat matching my tier 3. I'm hoping I'm not angering anybody too much. Pekka Rinne is in there just by virtue of being on a great team. He's not a great goalie, but the Nashville Predators will do very good things for him. Tuukka Rask, he's a guy who we wanted to be an above 925 save percentage guy last year, and he totally conked out. And Elon, you might have some thoughts to share on just how badly he conked out. As I talked about with Nick on the bonus episode, he's been dealing with some injuries, and he's getting towards 30, which might also be having an impact. I think the days of Tuukka Rask as a 925 goalie are behind us. I mean, he was a top 3, top 5 at worst goalie for the greater part of his career. But now I'm wondering if we start to see that sunset, especially with what's happening in front of him in Boston, with the front office making a series of questionable decisions, although keeping Claude Julien was not one of them. That was a good move, and hopefully that is going to help Rask a little bit be hopefully a 920 goalie. And I don't know how well the Bruins were, but I don't know how well the Bruins will perform, and that's why he's in tier 3 as opposed to tier 2. And few people are as big Tuukka Rask fanboys as I am. So for me to put him in tier 3, it took a lot. Elon, I'm curious to get your thoughts on that. I know you're very upset with him from his last season, but do you think overall it's fair to push him down just based on that to tier 3 instead of tier 2?
I do not think it's unfair, especially based on your definition, which was a goalie that is the entrenched number 1. Definitely he has that, but he has to be on an above average team and be an above average goalie. I'm not sure how above average Boston is as a team. Like, he only had 31 wins last year, even though he played all of those games. That put him like below the top 10 in goalie wins for the year. Like, that was as many wins as Craig Anderson had. And Craig Anderson was on the Ottawa Senators, who weren't a playoff threat at all. Anderson played 60 games and had 31 wins. Tuukka Rask, 64 games, also 31 wins. Also, I mean, sad to say, and yeah, he's been great for so long. Like, people are saying in the chat room how Tuukka Rask is one of the top goalies over the past 3 years. Yeah, that's true. 3 years ago, he had a 930 save percentage. 2 years ago, he had a 922 save percentage. Last year, 915. Okay, so that's like basically below league average. So probably he's not as bad as that 915 save percentage indicates, but I don't think he's going to go back to the 922 that he was 2 years ago. Like, he's still a decent goalie to have, and maybe you could get him so low in your draft. Like, maybe his performance last year will drop him so low that he ends up becoming a good draft steal, because he still is an entrenched number 1 goalie who could give you a stretch of a few good games. But I think tier 3 is definitely the place for him. Like, especially when we look at who we had in tier 2, I'm seeing guys like Corey Schneider and Jonathan Quick and Henrik Lundqvist. These are guys who I could really depend on to give me wins, or in Schneider's case, an amazing save percentage. I don't feel that way about Tuukka Rask, where I'm so certain about him, like I am those other guys, to get one of those categories.
Yeah, fair enough. I just, I'm so reluctant to do it that I need someone else to remind me that it is the okay decision. Essentially for Tuukka Rask, again, I'm lowering the ceiling on what I expect from him, or what I can hope for from him, from like a 924 to a 925 to hopefully a 920 if he shows up really strong this year. I have one other guy in my main tier 3, and then I kind of cheated here, but I'll get to that. The other guy, so we have Rene, Rask, Dubnyk, and Allen so far in tier 3. Number 4 is John Gibson, who is not as impressive as you might think. I want to put that out there. I know he's got the pedigree. I know he's been a blue chip prospect for a long time. I know he performed quite well last season for the Ducks, but I don't believe that he has shown me enough to convince me that he's an above average goalie in the league yet. Like, if he was a late round draft pick with no height behind him, I might consider him a career number 2, and that the Ducks are making a big mistake by giving him this number 1 job. But essentially, he's where he is because of the star power attached to his name. He was 12th last year in raw save percentage in all situations, but he was heavily buoyed by a very high shorthanded save percentage, which is something that has been shown to not necessarily be repeatable from year to year. So he's not going to be able to count on stopping 93% of the shots while his team is on the penalty kill. He was second only last year to Robin Lehner, and that gives you an idea that just about anybody can finish at the top of this category in a given year, although Robin Lehner played several fewer minutes. Similar minute comparables, Yaroslav Halak had a decent penalty kill save percentage. Ben Bishop had a good one last year. Brian Elliott also had a good year on the strength of his penalty kill save percentage. The point I'm making is that I'm just not sure that Gibson will have that magic in shorthanded situations. Again, that remains to be seen. And if you look at his just 1 year totals at even strength, so take away all that advantage he got there, he falls all the way to 26th amongst starters in even strength save percentage, which is not very good. 23rd in Mercat 60, so there's no light to be seen there. Gibson is borderline tier 4. The reason that he's tier 3 for me is because he's a guaranteed starter.
Guaranteed starter on a good team, right? Anaheim is a definite playoff team, in my opinion.
I can only say so many times that I have no idea where Randy Carlyle is going to take the Anaheim Ducks. I'm not going to make a huge prediction that they're going to be as good as last year. I think coaching alone is going to make a pretty key difference. So I think he's got a tougher battle ahead of him with Carlyle behind the bench than he would have if Boudreau had remained there.
So yeah, I feel like you're really convincing yourself to take him out of tier 3 because there's some names in your tier 4 that I feel like you're going to speak more highly of, but I guess we'll get there in a second. I want to read a couple of things from the chat room here that are interesting. Someone is saying Rene is too high. I saw that Simon here saying, I think Rene is too high. That's worth exploring, right? Because you have him in your tier 3. If you look at last year's leaders in save percentage, you have to look down for a long time to find Pekka Rinne down with a 908 save percentage. Like I was just hammering Tuukka Rask for his 915 and saying it was a slightly below average. Pekka Rinne was just like bad. Like there's no other way to say it. A 908 save percentage, I'm sure he's a great goalie compared to everyone else in the world, but for an NHL goalie, a 908 save percentage doesn't cut it, especially for a starting goalie. I know you're saying that Nashville is a really good team, but I mean, if he keeps playing like this, does he have any risk of being usurped by a backup goalie?
That is the concern in Nashville. I just think that the team in front of him is good enough to mask any issues he faces as a goalie. I think they're going to keep winning games with Pekka Rinne in net. So why would they make that change? I also don't know that there's a serious contender yet in Marek Mazanek. We'll see how things maybe play out during training camp. But I think I remember him seeing a brief spell of time last year and not totally impressing. Elon, if you can look it up, I think there was one other name in Nashville that tried to make a run. Maybe it was Carter Hutton at some point. And I thought Rinne was right for the plucking. It never happened in the end. And interestingly, I have Carter Hutton way down our list as somebody who might be able to take on Jake Allen now that he's in St. Louis. But you said you had to look so far down your list last year to find Pekka Rinne and save percentage. It's the same thing over the last 3 years. Like this was not just a bad year. I said I wasn't impressed with Jake Allen's numbers on the whole. Pekka Rinne ranks one below him in even strength save percentage over the last few years. But even worse, and actually much worse, Pekka Rinne is essentially dead last in Mercat per 60 amongst starters over the last 3 years. And that means you could put in essentially any other NHL goalie and they would have performed much better than Tuukka Rask would have. An average NHL goalie would have performed quite a bit better than Pekka Rinne has based on shot location in Nashville. So for that reason, I understand why Pekka Rinne might seem high at tier 3. I just don't see the Preds losing enough games for him to start to be doubted. I think he can hold steady well enough without completely embarrassing himself so that he holds on to the job, especially with no heir apparent.
Okay, but let me ask you this. If you're drafting your team for the Keeping Karlsson Ultimate Patron Fantrax League, the 3 goalie categories are wins. So yes, we're happy with him there. Or it's actually win goalie points. It's basically wins plus some points for overtime losses. Okay, then there's save percentage, which we don't think he's going to be good in. And then there's save points, which means he has to get a lot of saves, but also not let in a lot of goals. It's like a save minus 8 times goals against. Anyways, those are the categories. Would you be happy with Pekka Rinne as your number 1 goalie in like a couple? I guess tier 3 means you're saying that you'd want one guy in the top 2 tiers. But if you had Pekka Rinne on your team, would you be happy with it?
You know, I'd be okay with it. Elon, we made some rankings with that save point stat. I wonder if you can find them quickly enough to reference where he fell in the league last year in that stat. But I think he's going to be okay in wins. And save percentage, here's a strategy tidbit. In a head-to-head league, save percentage week to week fluctuates significantly. A really good goalie who puts up a strong season-long save percentage might still have a rough week once every 2 or 3 weeks, and that puts you at a disadvantage for that week. So Rinne, on the flip side of that, can have a really good week 1 out of every 2 or every 3 weeks, and depending on what your opponent's goalies are doing, it's just not such a repeatable thing from week to week. There's a lot of chance involved in save percentage as a category in head-to-head leagues, and that's something that is important to consider when making decisions just based on save percentage. Now, if you're in a roto league, in that case, Rene's going to hurt you a lot harder for a save percentage because that is a season-long thing. But on a week-to-week basis, it's like, what eighth seed teams believe entering in the playoffs, anything can happen.
Yeah, okay. That's funny that you say that. And yeah, it's fair. Plus, you could also maybe play him or sit him in the games where he's playing against an especially tough team. There's things you could do to try to control for your save percentage for sure. And you could also not play him if your other opponent has already gotten a bad save percentage. So there's things you can do. I agree. Okay, Brian, choose your own adventure time. You choose what you want to do next. We could either talk about one guy who in the chat room, people are saying they're surprised that he didn't make it into your tier 3. Or we could go with me telling you the guys that I had in my tier 3, which don't include that guy. Or you can talk about this sort of bonus extra tier that's part of your tier 3 sort of. Where do you want to go?
I would like to hear your guys, but how about I rattle off the rest of my tier 3 and then we'll go to you? Is that cool?
Okay. Yeah, so you're saying, so what exactly are you doing here? You're saying that you have someone that goalies who are in your tier 3, but not as high as these guys? Can't we just call it a different tier then?
So these are the goalies that I think are going to win their number 1 battles, and that would be enough to push them up into tier 3, in my opinion. There's just the questions of if they're going to, but I feel strongly enough that they can compared to other goalies in tandem situations that I would put them here. And 2 names, well, one name is going to be fairly obvious. One name is going to make you angry, and the other name is going to be, I think, maybe a bit of a surprise. I'll start with the obvious name, Connor Hellebuyck in Winnipeg. Just make this happen already. He was 3rd in the NHL in even strength save percentage last year. Mind you, he didn't have a huge sample size to go by, so we shouldn't necessarily be going by that, but everything looked good for him across the board. Interestingly enough, by the way, leading the league in even strength save percentage last year, Andrew Hammond in Ottawa on the strength of a very high shorthanded save percentage. And Brian Elliott was the other guy ahead of Hellebuyck. Anyway, Winnipeg's a decent team. Connor Hellebuyck's a great goalie. He is unquestionably tier 3 in my mind once he wins the starting job, hopefully out of training camp.
This is interesting. So these are guys who you think will be in tier 3, but there's just a bit more risk associated with them. You want to say that the number 1 goalies, but you can't say with 100% certainty that it'll happen because that's out of our hands. Okay, but assuming that Hellebuyck does take the number 1 job, he's going to be a really valuable goalie in fantasy. I see it. I like it. You're getting a lot of cheers and claps and pray icons in the chat room, so I guess they agree with you as well.
Okay, that's probably the least risky of these 3. The next least risky, the second least risky guy of these 3, Steve Mason. Here he is. It's time to put out my boy Steve Mason, who, I was always down on until he won me a very competitive league in a late season trade when I acquired him and didn't expect any. Anyway, whatever. We have history, me and Steve Mason. But last year, anyone who was making history with Steve Mason was sorely disappointed. He had just a .918 save percentage, so like a smidge above average, was losing starts to Michael Neuwirth. But here's where I look at even strength save percentage and say, man, he really deserved better. And I just want to go over quickly, because I don't know if I have, why we look at even strength save percentage, and I've alluded to it, is because all situation save percentage takes into account some small sample save percentages like shorthanded save percentage and power play save percentage that are small samples, so they're not necessarily reliable and they're not necessarily repeatable. Okay, so that's why I look at even strength save percentage. Steve Mason, 4th in the entire league in even strength save percentage, 4th in Mercad per 60, and that was no fluke. He's a top 5 guy in the 3-year sample for both. There's no question in my mind that he is a number 1 goalie. Whether Philly wants him or not is another question, but he is an incredible goalie when given the reins. Unfortunately, Philadelphia, well, they have a guy ready to challenge. Michael Neuwirth is not chopped liver, and the team in front is, so you can't really bump him up to tier 2, even if he was the undisputed number 1. But Steve Mason is my second least risky tier 3 pick of the risky guys.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. Steve Mason, his numbers, like you say, I guess if I were to summarize what you're saying about even strength save percentage versus regular save percentage, you're kind of saying he got a raw deal in that a lot of his goals he let in were on the shorthanded side. Like it was when Philadelphia was shorthanded, and those are obviously harder shots to save. And I guess it makes sense to say that that's not really his fault. It's a lot harder to save shots when your team is shorthanded, and you're saying he did really well at even strength and just got hammered shorthanded. My question to you is, is Philadelphia the type of team that we can trust to maybe not take so many penalties next year? Because if they're going to keep taking penalties, then they're going to keep hammering Steve Mason's save percentage.
So Steve Mason, I'm just doing some sorting here. If you look at how much time he spent on the penalty kill, I mean, and some of it is a function of playing 54 games. A lot of the guys ahead of him played 65, 66. So amongst goalies who played about as many games as him, he probably saw about the 5th most penalty minutes. It's not a huge sample, though. There's only like 8 guys who played about the same amount of games as him. So I don't know if it's a function, if it's a matter of him seeing fewer penalty kill situations or him just rebounding. Like, he finished 52 out of 55 goalies who saw some kind of time on the penalty kill. And actually the guy below him was Connor Hellebuck. So, oh, sorry, I paused. And the other guy just under Hellebuck is Andrew Hammond, who we talked about as having such a great even strength save percentage, but only had a raw 914. Anyway, I'm digressing a little bit. The bottom line is I'm digressing a little bit. The bottom line is I expect Steve Mason's penalty kill save percentage to bounce back regardless of whether he faces more or less time on the penalty kill.
Okay, Brian, give us your third risky but potential tier 3 goalie.
All right, here comes the controversy. I haven't really been able to keep an eye on the chat. I've just been so excited about what I'm talking about. Marc-Andre Fleury is my third tier 3 risky goalie. He had one of his better years last year, like one of the best years in a while, if you look at even strength save percentage, but it was all overshadowed by Matt Murray coming in during the playoffs because Fleury got concussed. And then Fleury came back probably before he should have and looked really weird and awkward in the net. And that also hurt his standing and erased a lot of the amazing things he did for Pittsburgh. Remember at the start of the year, they couldn't score. They stayed where they did in the standings because of Marc-Andre Fleury. That's why I think he still is starter material in the league. If it's for Pittsburgh or not, I don't know. But in my conversation with Nick a few days ago, he did raise some red flags about Matt Murray. And for me, that was enough to say, I think Fleury is going to win the starter's job. You know, he's only been so-so in his 3-year sample, and he is turning 32. So it's not like a sure deal for me. But I think that maybe Murray trying to get some more experience and feeling some extra pressure and being in this goalie battle, I feel like Marc-Andre Fleury's experience and talent might win out.
Okay, it's a good call, like, I think, because he's the kind of guy, maybe you don't want to depend on him as your number 1 goalie, but if you could get him late as your number 1, but if you could get him late as your number 2 goalie, and then he ends up stealing that job in Pittsburgh, he could end up being like one of the top 5 most valuable fantasy contributors. Like, Pittsburgh's probably going to win a lot of games. I think it's worth taking that risk, and I have a feeling a lot of people are going to be taking Matt Murray ahead of Marc-Andre Fleury, especially if you're in a keeper league. Even a shallow keeper league, I think people are looking at Murray as maybe one of these top goalies you have to grab because he'll carry your team forever. Let them maybe do that, and maybe you could just enjoy Marc-Andre Fleury and get that win next season. Also, Julian in the chat room is saying that maybe they'll play him a lot to up his trade value. I don't know about that, but you know that obviously one of these goalies is going to have to be available for Las Vegas in the expansion. So maybe it's possible that Pittsburgh will just want to give Fleury a lot of time so they could trade him for someone at the trade deadline. And again, usually teams who trade for someone like that are teams that are in, going for the playoffs or going for the Stanley Cup. So it would probably be a decent destination for him. Maybe he could go to Dallas. Dallas is just my team that I think people will get traded to at the trade deadline just because Niemi and Lettinen are so bad. And I guess we'll get to them at some point on this podcast. By the way, Brian, it's 8:55. Oh my gosh, we have so much more to go. But yeah, I think it's a good call.
Dallas is obviously the best team that needs a goalie, so I see why you keep going there. I also agree with you that Matt Murray is likely to be the first Penguins goalie taken in most drafts, so I'm saying don't be that guy. I won't be that guy for sure. And here, it is getting late. I'm still good to go, though. It's Smörgoåliesbord. It's a special night. Elon, how about we do this? How about you tell us who you had in tier 3, point out the guys that I didn't have, and then we'll talk about the patrons, and then we'll head to tier 4.
Sounds good, man. Okay, we're giving a lot of people a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff here. Smörgoåliesbord, again, it's not our regular episode. Normally, we have everything really well organized, exactly what we're going to talk about. Here, we're going to talk about every single goalie. So obviously, we're going a bit off the cuff. I hope you guys have been enjoying it. All right. I actually am looking at the guys who I had in my tier 3, and now I'm kind of embarrassed, and I feel like they don't belong there. They should be in tier 4. Because we're talking about goalies that are in great situations and an above average team and goalie. And actually, the 3 guys who I had there, now that I'm thinking about it, maybe they're not above average teams. Maybe they're more like average teams. Maybe I'll just save that. I'll mention who they were when we get to tier 4. But before we move forward, let's thank the patrons of Keeping Karlsson, because we just want to thank them. We love the patrons, and we want to tell you thank you so much for supporting the show all throughout the summer. The people who stuck with us throughout the summer, we appreciate it so much. Kept us going through our summer series. We're very excited now that we're about to get into the regular season, and the Facebook group is heating up, Brian. There's been a lot of people asking us about keepers and about trades before the season starts. It's only going to get busier. And, the Facebook group is great, not only because Brian and I are there to answer questions, but also because you have all the smart patrons there. So I just wanted to mention, if that's something you might be interested in going into your fantasy hockey season, you could become a patron of Keeping Karlsson, support the podcast, and get access to our patron-only Facebook group and our monthly patron cast, where you could come and join us for a show just like this, but where you decide what we do. So Brian and I don't have to hand-wring about what to do next, because we just answer all of your questions.
I'd like to welcome some of the people who just joined us to the patron program and who are discovering just how wonderful it can be. A lot of the times you can ask us on Twitter anytime. We're happy to respond. You might get like 140 character answer, and that's about it. On the Facebook group, there are huge discussions about each question, about every single angle, and it's worth joining. So thanks a lot for your support to Mike M, Adam L, Brandon W, Colin G, Dustin A, Garrett T, Wiki, Mike W, Peter F, Max F, Gnarly Crow, Edric J, Peter O, some returning patrons here, Jesse H, Alexis T, Benoit R, Peter K, Brian W, Brian A, Ryan G, Scott W, Tom J, Dro N, we're going to go with, Chris K, Bruce the Moose, Liam S, and Thomas P is also in there. Welcome.
Matthew, welcome, guys. Thank you so much. Matthew's saying we're getting closer to that nacho bar. Yeah, if we could get up to $20,000 a month in support, we are going to open a craft beer and nachos bar, which I'm very excited about. We're not there yet, but we're on our way.
We're getting there. Also, by the way, Nick H and Matthew W and Daniel V, and welcome back to.
Okay, yeah. By the way, if you become a new patron and you're cool with us saying your full name, let us know. We're just not ever sure if you're comfortable with us, totally saying your name on the podcast. All right, Brian, we got to move on. Again, thanks to the patrons. Check it out, keepingkarlsson.com/patron if you're interested. No more advertisements today, I promise, though. Remember, Puck Tees, thank you for sending us these cool t-shirts.
Pucktees.org, at Pucktees on Twitter.
Okay.
I posted a tweet to my t-shirt, although you could see a nicer picture of it on the website.
All right.
All
so
right.
let's get into tier 4 now. So I guess we're talking now that we've gone through goalies in great situations with above average teams and being above average goalies, I guess now we're getting into some goalies who one of those things is not above average. We're getting into where at least one of these things is average or below average. So let me know exactly if I'm right about how I'm defining your tier 4, and then tell me who's there.
Yeah, I mean, it's all sort of relative, so it's hard to say. I have it listed here as guys who are number 1 goalies with 2 parts average between their team and their talent, but a lot of these guys probably fall a little bit below average on at least, actually they definitely do. So I think you characterized it better. I also have a tier 4B. I know that's cheating, but before I even get to that, I just want to mention, we've mentioned 17 goalies, or I have, in my tiers so far. You probably want to try and grab one of those guys. And the next several tiers are tiers that you might rearrange based on which guy you got. So my tier 4, you might already be looking at guys in tier 5 and 6 instead. You might be like, my goalies already are good enough that I don't need to worry about tier 4. I'm going to look for a solid number 3 goalie, lower at tier 5 or 6. I don't care if all of tier 4 is gone.
Yeah, I think one thing to consider is as you're drafting, you kind of have to come up with your strategy for the season a little bit. If you, let's say, take Corey Schneider as your top goalie, maybe you've made the decision at that point, I'm not going to go for wins. I want to go for save percentage. And if that's what you've decided, then maybe you just want to focus on getting not guys who are going to play a lot of games, but potentially hurt your save percentage. Maybe you'd rather get a tandem guy who has a better save percentage. And, the inverse is true. If you've picked Pekka Rinne, maybe at that point you're like, I'm probably going to have some bad days, but I'm going for wins. So I want want to get the guys who are going to play a lot of games. So yeah, it is true, Brian, that these tiers are not set in stone, and it really does depend on what your strategy is moving forward. But we're talking now about number one goalies who are at least average in something. So who do you got?
All right. Okay. I should just say yes, right? Instead of convoluting it by explaining the difference in my tier 4s.
Okay, well, why don't you first just say your tier 4A, and then we'll get into that. Matthew's asking, but then you won't get starts. And he's talking about my strategy that I said that if you're getting the guys who will just give you save percentage, well, there's only like 2 or 3 min goalie starts. I'm pretty sure you're going to get them from Corey Schneider. So I was saying in that case, you could just have that backup guy to help your save percentage when you need it. Okay, Brian, go ahead. Give us your tier 4A.
All right. I'm glad we returned to that after going on 2 tangents. All right, tier 4A. Semyon Varlamov, Cam Talbot, Freddie Anderson, Craig Anderson, Robin Lehner, Brian Elliott, and I have a guy who, I feel like I want to move him down to tier 5, so I'm not going to say his name.
Wait a minute. Okay, that's funny because I see your list. All right, so first let's talk about who you talked about. So we've got guys here. These are goalies, to me, who are like for sure still number one goalies on their team with like very little competition, but we're not sure if like they're that good and also how good their teams are. Like Semyon Varlamov. Here, how about I'll give you my comments on each one, then you could sort of chime in and let me know what you think about them.
Yeah, sure, but you've definitely identified the theme here is that they're all undisputed number one goalies on teams of questionable quality, and some of their own individual quality might still be in question. So you go ahead.
All right. Well, yeah. So, and I'm going to tell you also which of these guys I actually originally had in my tier 3. So this will be fun. Semyon Varlamov, I didn't have in my tier 3. Varlamov is a guy who's just been going down in his save percentages, and Colorado has not been helping him get wins. I do think he's an interesting pick here. Oh, also he's an injury concern. So there's a lot of red flags with Semyon Varlamov, but I think on his best day, he can be really good. Like you can get him and then have a few weeks where he like carries you. And don't forget, like 2 seasons ago now, or maybe it's 3 seasons ago, he was one of the top fantasy goalies in the league. Colorado had insane shooting percentages, and all the average numbers were sort of like not what they should have stayed at, and they weren't sustainable. And he fell, and he's fallen hard. Last year, not a great year for Varlamov. He only had 27 wins and a .914 save percentage, so below average. But who knows? New coach. I know we all talk about how Patrick Waugh wasn't the best at deciding like how to deploy his players. Maybe with the new coach, Patrick Waugh gone, Bednar in, maybe Varlamov can turn things around a little bit. Maybe Colorado could turn things around a bit, get a bit more wins, because they are a talented team. They have some good players. So I think Varlamov is like a sneaky guy that you could take here. I think tier 4 is the place for him. He's going to fall in your draft, and he might be someone to target as like a number 2 goalie. I wouldn't be so disappointed if I had him as my number 2. And then, all right, who did you have next here? Talbot. Talbot's very interesting. He's one of the guys actually that I did consider to be in my tier 3. And the reason is I think he's an above average goalie. I think from what we've seen from him, and you could look at all of your charts and all of your 3 years, even strength save percentage, let me know where he ranks. Just looking at last year, Cam Talbot, where did he land in save percentage? I know that he was good.
He was actually 22nd in the league in all situations, even strength save percentage, 28th in even strength save percentage. But I'm gonna spell you here by reminding everybody that he had some really rough starts to start the year, even a couple rough ones to end the year. Anders Nilsson was good enough to outplay him for a chunk, but he really did get rolling at one point.
Yeah, okay, so now that I'm looking at the splits, in October and November, Cam Talbot was a below 900 goalie. So that's like, we talked about Pekka Rinne not being good at like 908. This is like just horrible. If you're a below 900 goalie, you're like killing your fantasy owner's save percentage every game. But then he turned it around big time. December, January, he was 934 and 932. Also in March, he was 935. Like, so he had a really strong end to the year. I think he, took some time. He had never been a starting goalie on a team before. I guess it took him some time to learn how to do it. At least that's how I'm shaping the narrative for myself. And I think Cam Talbot is a good goalie. I think above average. I'm pretty confident in him. And I think Edmonton could be like an average team. I think I said this on the last episode where I'm concerned to say that because we always think it and it never happens. But Edmonton, now they have Puljujarvi just to add to all the good young players they have. I think they could be good. So I don't know. Cam Talbot, I'd be very happy to have as my second goalie. Let me put it that way. I don't know if he belongs in tier 3. Maybe tier 4 is still the place for him, but I don't know if that will last going into next season. Like, I think Varlamov will still be a tier 4 guy next year. I think Cam Talbot won't be.
What Cam Talbot absolutely has going for him next year is that Jonas Gustafsson is his backup. And when has Jonas Gustafsson ever stolen an NHL job? Never. It's never happened. I think maybe on those like Vesa Toskala Leafs days, or I feel like somewhere in that era or shortly after, Gustafsson was able to get the net for a little while for lack of a better option. He's not even an NHL backup. It's a very questionable choice by the Oilers to get a very weak backup goalie behind a number one who, is still unproven. Like Elon, yeah, he definitely had a good 40-game stretch. There's definitely some promise there. Just not 100% yet, but there's no doubt that he's going to be a strong volume starter and could have more endurance than Varlamov.
Okay, yeah, and maybe we should speed up a little bit how we talk about these guys, but then you had Frederik Andersen. I think we've said a lot about him over the summer series. He's going to Toronto. We expect Toronto to be better. Andersen has held his own. He's been at least an average NHL goalie, but it's still not a great team, and maybe he's not completely proven. So I think I agree with you there. Tier 4 seems like a good place for him. Then you have Craig Anderson on Ottawa. He's a guy who I think is actually like a really good goalie. He gets injured all the time, which is frustrating. And Ottawa is one of those teams where it's hard to trust that they won't let in a lot of goals and blow up your save percentage. Like if you're in a league with saves, Craig Anderson is really good because Ottawa lets in a lot of shots. Maybe they'll be better next year, but I agree with you that I wouldn't take him above any of those guys you had in tier 3. So I think this is a good spot for him. But I think Anderson, a lot like Talbot, could be the kind of guy who could give you sneaky value at this pick. And then I guess I'll bring up the other guy you had in your list. And then I'll bring up the next guy you had in your list because I think that these three all kind of go together. Robin Lehner, I'm making the connection because the two Andersons are both named Anderson. And then you have Lehner, who used to play on the same team as Craig Anderson. And now Lehner is the starter on Buffalo. You're higher on Lehner than I am. We talked about him actually on an episode a couple of weeks ago, so we don't need to go into him too much, but you think that he still has some upside there and Buffalo could be a good team. I think Lehner is just unproven, and I think he's an injury risk, so I wouldn't be happy with him as my number 2 goalie personally.
So of all the guys we've mentioned so far, just rattling back or just answering back to some of your points, Frederik Andersen is probably my favorite of the Varlamov, Talbot, Anderson, Lehner group. He's ranked the highest. He's the top 15 goalie in even strength save percentage, or at least he was last year. We haven't seen a huge sample from him, so we'll see what he does with a heavy workload. Craig Anderson, yeah, he's been okay. I used to like him as a sneaky above average goalie. Now he's more of like a sneaky average or below average goalie, and I'm starting to wonder, I'm getting in my own head here, if Andrew Hammond is a risk, leading the league in even strength save percentage last year, only over 24 appearances, but he was also just crushed by his shorthanded save percentage. And I wonder what he might be able to do with more time. There's Matt O'Connor and Binghamton also pushing. I don't know. I wonder if Anderson is riper than he's been in the past. Is that ridiculous?
I think that you're pulling a darling that I did last year. I think that Craig Anderson will lose games not because of his backup, but because his groin is going to get injured or he's going to cut his hand or whatever Craig Anderson does to get injured.
So I'm not saying Andrew Hammond is going to like proactively take the job, but I'm more open to the idea today than I ever have been. And Robin Lehner is just a wild card. He could be great. He might not be. We know he's going to get a lot of starts in Buffalo either way. So that's a reason to draft him. Elon, we haven't yet gotten to a guy in tier 4 who I'm actually starting to wonder, like, this is the last guy I put in tier 4, and I'm wondering if he should have been in tier 3. Brian Elliott. Yeah. I want to get your thoughts on him. Do you want to go first or should I?
No, I will. I was just about to say I was saving the best for last in the list that you gave. I would say Elliott is the top guy that you put in your tier 4. Calgary, was not that great, but in my opinion, the reason why Calgary was especially bad was because their goaltending was so bad. So I feel like it's so hard to decide how bad of a team Calgary is or how good of a team they are because Kari Ramo and who was that guy?
Red O'Bara?
No, he was on Colorado.
All right. Joni Ortio. They all have funny names.
Yeah. They were just really bad and they cost them games, I think. These were guys who were having below 900 save percentages. Now they have Brian Elliott, a really good goalie, one of the top goalies in save percentage for the last couple of seasons. Their defense seems really strong. Maybe they're a bit shallow on offense, but they still score their fair share of goals. Gojo and Monahan, they score the points that 2 lines should be scoring. So I don't know. I think Elliott could be a sneaky pick. Plus the stuff I was saying before about how they play on a lot of off days, that makes him really valuable in fantasy just because he's going to get most of his starts. If you have 3 goalies, sometimes you have to sit one of them like on a busy Saturday, but Elliott's playing on a lot of Monday, Wednesday, Friday, Sundays. So I think I would put Brian Elliott at the top of tier 4 or maybe in tier 3.
Yeah, really close to tier 3. The off game, yeah, really close to tier 3. The off night thing is a really good consideration. I'll go to his numbers now. He was the top goalie in even strength save percentage last year, and he was top 5 in Mercat per 60. He was 4th, so top 5 does him injustice. And in the last 3 years, he's been top 10 in both. And you might say that, well, St. Louis is protecting him, and that's why he's done so well. But that's where Mercat per 60 minutes helps us and takes that context into account and saying, hey, he's gotten great D and team play in front of him in St. Louis, but you throw in an average goalie and he's going to do worse than Brian Elliott did. And you look at Jake Allen and you see that in practice. So Brian Elliott definitely at the top of tier 4 and maybe in tier 3. It really depends. The X factor for me in Calgary is I don't know how much faith I have in Glenn Gulutzan behind the bench. I didn't have a lot in Bob Hartley. They have a great D-core to work with. Like you were saying, Brody, Giordano, Hamilton, just for starters. And they've got a solid line up front, but notice the singular there. So that'll be the challenge for Brian Elliott to see if the team in front of him can get him the wins that we would want to be able to expect from a tier 3 goalie. And for that reason, I sort of have him just at the top of tier 4.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I'm convinced I'm moving him to tier 3. Like, I think Calgary, I've never been too concerned about Calgary scoring goals. Like, they're not going to set the world on fire, but I think if they could get decent goaltending, and I think Brian Elliott could provide it, I think he's going to get at least an average number of wins. And then I think his save percentage and role put him over the top for me. Brian, so I have a guy that I was considering to put in my tier 3, and then I got embarrassed and decided, no, maybe I'd have him in my tier 4, but you haven't even mentioned him in your tier 4, so I'm going to say him now because also Simon just mentioned him in the chat room. Where's Peter Mrazek in this list? He is, I think at this point, it's funny because I actually listened to last year's Smörgoåliesbord, like I said recently, and you were saying at the time that you still thought, and obviously I'm pointing out the times that you were wrong. You were right on so many things that I was wrong about, but you were saying that you thought Jimmy Howard still had the job in Detroit and he was going to be able to hold on to it. Mrazek tore that job out of his hands for most of the year. Howard did get starts at the end of the year, though, which maybe is why Mrazek is falling and why you're concerned. So I can see that. But at the end of the day, Mrazek's now played in 4 seasons overall, but really he's played 2 seasons, one where he got half the starts, then last year where he played a whole bunch of times. He's a career .920 save percentage at this point. So in 94 games. So yeah, small sample size, but still that's an above average save percentage, top role on his team. And I would say Detroit at the very least is an average team, right? Like maybe they're not the for sure playoff team that they were for 30 years before that, but I don't think they're a for sure not playoff team. They still have a lot of young forwards. Their defense seems a little shallow, but I don't know. I think Peter Mrazek should definitely be in tier 4, if not. Okay, I'm convinced not tier 3. There's a bit of a red flag about how he ended last season, but I still think he should be in tier 4. Tell me why I'm wrong.
I don't know that you are. That's the thing. I had him in tier 4. And when I was going down my list and I said there's a guy whose name I'm not going to say yet because I'm not sure I'm a believer, it's Peter Mrazek's name, and it's not his individual skill that's in question to me. I mean, he did have some rough patches last year, left himself susceptible to challenges by Jimmy Howard of all people. But the team in front of him, I don't know if it's enough to convince me to take a risk on a guy who still might not be the number 1, even though I think he deserves to be in it. And I think he will be too. I think maybe that's a little presumptuous of me to think that Jimmy Howard is going to mount another challenge, especially with both goalies being another year older. Peter Mrazek is good. I just want to go through that first. He's ahead of Martin Jones in the last 3 years in similar minutes played. He's also ahead of Jonathan Quick and Craig Anderson and Devin Dubnyk and Ben Bishop. This is all at even strength save percentage, although a lot of those goalies who aren't Martin Jones have played many more minutes than Mrazek has. Mrazek actually compares fairly well to Brian Elliott too. And last year he was a top 15 guy in the metrics we're talking about this episode. The question is, what the heck is going on in Detroit? There seem to be so many weird situations, weird coaching decisions, weird slumps from stars. Yeah, they had that whole thing with Henrik Zetterberg in the locker room. And now they signed Danny DeKeyser to a huge contract. And all this just makes me feel like there's not a lot of really smart thinking going into the decisions that are being made for this team. And because of that, I'm just not sure that Detroit is as close to teams like Colorado and Edmonton and Ottawa and Toronto and Calgary as they are to teams like Columbus and Vancouver and Arizona.
Okay. All right, fair. That's your reasoning. Mrazek, definitely, if you could get him this late in the draft, like after all these goalies we've already mentioned, you might end up with a shining star. Like last year for the first half of the season, he was like one of the top goalies in fantasy. Like if you had him, you were rolling completely. Then like we've talked about, he fell off. But I think he belongs here. Simon is saying, could Mrazek not be like a poor man's Schneider? Well,
I think that's a very clever comment. I think it's a really good take on it. And I feel like we're getting to a few guys who might be a poor man's Schneider. They're just on much worse teams than Schneider, and they're not quite as good as Schneider.
Also, I just feel like Peter Mrazek, give me a full season with a solid save percentage without inconsistency before I give him that label. Like, Schneider, come on. Like, he's been so good for so long, even on not great teams. So I'm not ready to say that yet. It's an interesting thing to say, but I don't want to depend 100% on Mrazek giving you like a really great save percentage. He did it for a while. I want to see it for a full season. Brian, there's one guy we haven't said that last year was in tier 3. Now we don't even have him in tier 4. 2 years ago, in our first Smörgoåliesbord episode, he was in tier 2. So he's really fallen off. And I want to get your thoughts on him. I had him still in my tier 4, but maybe like I'm just clinging to something that's falling away. But no love for Sergei Bobrovsky, the former Vezina Trophy winner. Like, yeah, last year was not great for sure. Only 15 wins, a 908 save percentage, his worst year by far in a long, long time. But at the same time, you know, before that, he was one of the top goalies in the league. He had 918 the year before that. So that's like at least above average. And before that, like 923. The year before that, 932. That was that Vezina year. So I just wonder if we're like, I know that Bobrovsky has a lot of red flags. I wonder if last year maybe his injuries hurt him, and maybe now that he's had the summer to heal, maybe he'll be better next year. Like, I just don't see him as someone who's like a tier 5 guy. I would still be happy. Like, maybe not as, I don't know, because I guess we'll see on draft day if I could put my money where my mouth is. I'm not sure if I'd want him as my number 2 goalie, but definitely if I could get him as my number 3 goalie, that would be really exciting for me, because that's a guy who I think could still put up good save percentage numbers. I know your interview with Nick, like, he didn't exactly agree, and he said that he thinks that Bobrovsky's, you know, on the tail end of his career, but he's only 27. Like, I guess it's these injuries. I don't know. Like, why is Bobrovsky so far down from last year for you?
Because of what I've seen in the last 2 seasons and 3, and injuries for sure. I mean, that incredible Vezina season he had was the lockout shortened year. He had a 932 over 38 games. Great. He followed it up with an above average season, 923 in 58 games. Still very good. And then followed that up with a 918, and then a 908 last year. It just, I want to see more than what I've seen. So far, he's had 100 games or, 100 games. So far, he's had 100 games where he's played like an above average NHL goalie very convincingly. I think he might have also had a better team in front of him in those years, a better coach on the bench. There's not a lot to like about Columbus, and he's had those injury issues as well. I just don't know that he can carry that team, or that they can carry him to a successful season. I actually think he might have his job in dispute with the way Jonas Korpisalo performed. We'll get to his name a little later in this marathon Smörgoåliesbord, but just to give the hard numbers on Bobrovsky, he was just a bottom feeder in every important goaltending metric last year. And in the 3-year sample now, that Vezina winning season was 4 years ago. So that's out of the sample. And he's not even a top 20 goalie in the NHL by the metrics we've been using on the show, even strength save percentage and Mercad per 60. And for that reason, I just don't have a lot of faith in him to put up great or even average or even above average numbers on such a really crummy team in a rough situation.
All right. That's fair. I'm convinced. I don't
All
want
right. So
Yeah. So, okay, let's get into the next tier already. So we're through 4 tiers. We're definitely through all the goalies that you want as your number 1. We're getting maybe even past the guys you'd be comfortable with as your number 2. But there's still a lot of goalies left in the league. So here are guys who we're not so confident in. Maybe, like, what do you have as your next tier?
So before we move on to tier 5 for sure, which has Bobrovsky in it, there's tier 4B, where you can try and swing for the fences. These are the guys that I think are they're definitely in tandem situations, and I'm just not sure if they're going to win the job. And even if they do, I don't know how well they're going to perform. They are, just quickly, Antti Niemi and Kari Lehtinen. If you want to take a bet on one, go ahead. Niemi would be the guy I choose. but you're looking at some really frustrating weeks, likely with either one. You might get the wins. The rest of the stats might not look so good. Then you have in Long Island, you've got Thomas Greiss and Yaroslav Halak. I think Greiss is the better goalie at this point of the two, and I'm actually quite confident by the end of the year he will be the number one goalie. But New York, or the Islanders, I can't just say New York, the New York Islanders have taken, I think, a bit of a step back. I don't know that they're on that same exciting trajectory that they had been for the 2 years prior to this, losing Okposo, adding Ladd, and just not making any strides forward necessarily, while teams around them might have been doing so. So I don't know if you can consider Greiss as a number one for the New York Islanders being as good a thing for this upcoming season as it might have been last year. And the other guy who I think is in tough to win his tandem battle is Matt Murray. He's got a shot. That's why he's still into it. He's got a shot. That's why he's still in tier 4B and not a lot lower. But I'm not sure that he's shown me enough to make me want to grab him or categorize him in any higher spot. It's getting late. There's going to be a few more slip-ups. Sorry.
Okay, so all right, so tier 4B here for you is interesting. It's like guys who, if they steal the job, they're in tandems. All these guys, Niemi, Lehtinen, Greiss, Halak, and Murray are in tandems. If they could steal the job, they could be higher tier guys. But unlike the ones you had in kind of like 3B, where you were confident they would win their jobs, these are guys where you don't have much confidence. That's fair. I think Thomas Greiss, by the way, he like underrated, right? If you look at I've got here the last 2 years, even strength save percentage, he ranks 9th. Of all the goalies who have played, I guess, at least 2,500 minutes I've got here. But that's like really good. So Greiss there. I agree with you. I think he should steal the job on the Islanders. It's interesting, though, how you said that you think the Islanders maybe aren't going to be as good as we've been thinking of them for the past couple of years. I don't know about that. They still have John Tavares, but maybe their defense is a bit shallow. So, okay, but I like Thomas Greiss. I don't know if I would want him as one of my top 2 goalies, but I'd be really happy to have him as a number 3. I don't think I'd want Halak. I know that he's probably the higher paid goalie, and he'll still be given a chance. But either he'll lose the job because Greiss is better, or he'll lose the job just because he gets injured. Okay, so now I guess we've still got some number 1 goalies who we haven't mentioned. I assume that's going to be your tier 5 number 1 goalies who are going to get a lot of games, but just like aren't very good, or their teams are just not really good, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I'm just going to say the names, and I think it'll give you a very good picture of who they are. So Sergei Bobrovsky, declining goalie, I think, on a very weak team. Ryan Miller, another declining goalie on a very weak team, although we do have to give him and another guy in tier 5, Mike Smith, credit for having some reals last year and being able to keep up a very high save percentage for a little while, but then not being able to keep up, maybe due in part to their bodies, or just the team in front of them was wearing them down by making them work so hard. And Elon, did we formally put Peter Mrazek in a tier yet? Because if not, this is where I have him amongst this group. It feels low,
yeah.
But again, it's more of a team thing than it is a goalie thing, and I feel like the team differentiates him more from the other tiers than his individual performance does.
No, I definitely don't have Mrazek here. I was considering putting Mrazek in my tier 3. I'm definitely not putting him with the Cam Wards in tier 5 and Ryan Millers of like not good teams and goalies who I'm not sure of. I think that Detroit is an okay team, and I think Mrazek is going to be at least an okay goalie. So I'll have him higher. I think another interesting name here of all of them you said is Mike Smith. I still think Mike Smith has something left in him to have some good games sometimes. I guess that's kind of what you said. And I also think that Arizona might have a somewhat competitive team next year. Is that crazy to say? Like, they picked up Goligoski on defense. They've got Max Domi like as a year with more experience. They have some other good young forwards. I don't know. I just have a feeling that Mike Smith might surprise. Of course, there's Louis Domingue challenging, so maybe that's why you don't want to bet too much on Mike Smith, even if you're just going for saves, because Domingue did have a good run last year, but it was when Mike Smith was injured. When Mike Smith came back, Domingue really didn't get a shot to play many games, so I wouldn't be too fooled with Domingue. And I still think Smith will be the number 1 in Arizona next year. So maybe I would consider him. He is tier 5, I agree, but I would say at the top of this tier. And then at the bottom of the tier, definitely Cam Ward. I definitely wouldn't want to draft him. I think that he'll definitely lose his job before the year is over.
Did you notice? I think I even omitted Cam Ward from my list because I just couldn't say his name. I'm so tired of Cam Ward being considered a number 1 goalie, and he just signed a new contract. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that. Elon, what you mentioned about Mike Smith, maybe with Domingue. That's the thing about this tier is that they're volume starters, but you'll notice in my next tier, I've got pretty much all their backups listed. In fact, I almost had Eddie Lack up in 4B with the tandems as like a Murray or Grice-like guy. And I feel like maybe he belonged there. He just had a really weak season last year because he was given coaching that didn't play to his strengths and the team didn't play to what normally worked for him. I'm a big believer in Eddie Lack, but the whole team and coaching staff has to buy in on what he's able to do. And that didn't happen in Carolina yet, which is why I sort of nudged him down. But he could be a guy who's in 4B. So speaking of these backups, so Bobrovsky could be pushed in by a tier 6 goalie, Korpisalo. Miller could be pushed by Markstrom. Ward could be pushed by Lack. Those are the 3 starter backup matches I have there. You'll notice I don't have Domingue there just because I feel more strongly about the skill level at this point of Eddie Lack, Jonas Korpisalo, and Jacob Markstrom. I think they're all a little bit more likely to be average NHL starters when they do get the opportunity. My other tier 6 names, James Reimer, only down there because I think he is the number 2 to Roberto Luongo. Michael Neuwirth, he had a great season last year. He could be a number 1 somewhere. I don't think it's going to be Philly. And I have Andrei Pavlik in there just because he's probably the best volume guy you can get this low, according to my tiers. So he's only there because if the Jets continue to be ridiculous and not anoint Hellebuck as their number 1, Pavlik is going to get starts as a function of that. He's going to get some wins.
Okay, so I think the main controversy here in your tier 6 is going to be with Michael Neuwirth. So I know that a lot of people are kind of banking on him to be like a 50-50 guy with Mason. You've already talked about Mason and how, like, and the reasoning for why you put him so high. I believe you had Mason in your tier 3, and now we're down at tier 6. And so Neuwirth, you're going to scare a lot of people right now who maybe are deciding to keep Neuwirth in a keeper league or, draft them high. So, like, do you really think that Neuwirth is, like, not even in the group with Grice and Matt Murray? Like, you think that Mason has so much more of a secure hold on the job than guys like, Halak and, well, I guess tier 4B had Halak and Grice, but you know what I mean? Like, why are they in different tiers, Grice and Neuwirth?
I'm thinking about it.
I think that Neuwirth should be up in 4B.
Okay, point taken, and especially with the idea that was thrown out in our bonus episode about maybe Steve Mason is a rhythm goalie. Maybe he's someone who can't handle being pushed by another guy, and that would definitely open the door for Neuwirth. He is one of the better low-volume goalies. Like, Thomas Greiss is far and away the best goalie who has not been in a starting role at any point in the last 3 years. He rules that category. Neuwirth is down below Mrazek, and, well, Jones was a starter, but still has a pretty low games played total. Neuwirth is closer to, like, Jake Allen. So I feel like he's okay. He was 4th in the league last year in all situation save percentage, but take away a very good shorthanded save percentage, and he was 17th at even strength. Not impressive. Even lower in Mercad per 60. So for that reason, I'm not that high on Michael Neuwirth being a legitimate challenger. The only thing I see going in his favor is that if it hurts Steve Mason's psyche to be that close to losing his number 1 job, and that could open the door. But if they both play at their top level through the first half of the season, there's no question in my mind that Neuwirth doesn't have a shot at that number 1 job.
All right. Okay. So that was tier 6. Number 2s you think have a chance to threaten for number 1. You had Reimer, Lack, Neuwirth, Korpisalo, Markstrom, and then Pavlik there just because you had to put Pavlik somewhere. Okay. What do we have left? So I guess we have just one more tier, right? Guys who are for sure backups, but maybe still worth drafting, like in a somewhat deep league. Is that what we're going to now?
Yeah, we're looking at deep number 2s, guys who you might even not realize that they switched teams in the offseason or which goalies they're backing up, but they have a number 1 that could be pushed, and they might also be on a team that has a pretty good roster in front of them, or the goalie themselves has a skill set that could be average or above average, which is hard to find at this point after all the above goalies have been taken. So just to summarize that quickly, we're looking at deep number 2, so you wouldn't expect a challenge, but maybe they have what it takes to push for more playing time and give you good numbers based on their own skill level and the team in front of them.
All right, so who do we got in this list?
So this list is quite long. It's really hard to predict, but I'll give you my top 5 picks for goalies to push for more playing time. Carter Hutton in St. Louis is my dark horse this year. I actually like him to push Jake Allen a little more than you like Calvin Pickard to push Semyon Varlamov. I think he's been okay in the past, and I wonder with a strong St. Louis team in front of him, just what he's able to do, although he was the beneficiary earlier in his career of some Barry Trotz coach teams as well, if I'm remembering correctly. Calvin Pickard is also in this category. Andrei Vasilevsky is in this category. Jonas Enroth in Toronto. Maybe he can get a few more games over Frederik Andersen than we're anticipating. And Louis Domingue in Arizona.
Okay. Yeah, these are all guys who probably are going to be waiver wire guys for people in most leagues, especially unless they're like really deep leagues. But yeah, these are the kinds of guys that maybe you take for the Sunday back-to-back to try to win your matchup once it's announced that the backup is going to play. But some of these guys, I agree, might have the potential to steal some games. You know that I like Pickard a little bit, maybe more than you. I think that Varlamov has shown himself to be weak and Pickard has shown himself to be good. So I think there is a job maybe waiting for Pickard, or at least he'll have the chance with the new coach to try to ingratiate himself. Carter Hutton, very interesting. I don't think we've ever brought him up as a guy who we thought was anything special, but I guess you're not 100% convinced by Jake Allen, like you said. So could happen. I'm curious to see if you'll be right on that. You'll sound really smart.
I think I am trying to just sound really smart because his numbers aren't very good and aren't anything to indicate that we have a diamond in the rough. But yeah, just throwing it out there. I think it speaks more to my lack of faith in Jake Allen and the quality of St. Louis, that any goalie who gets to see that crease probably has value the moment they step into it.
Okay, and then there's one name missing from that list that I think belongs there. Especially, I'm surprised you didn't have this guy there just because you weren't too excited about the starting goalie, but you don't have Jonathan Bernier anywhere in your list, and he's the backup on Anaheim, and you were saying how you're not sure if John Gibson is as talented as people think, and you think maybe Anaheim might be making a mistake by putting all of their eggs in the John Gibson basket, but they haven't really, because Jonathan Bernier is a somewhat established NHL goalie. He's had some good years. He's had some really bad years, but that was during the time that he played for Toronto, who were brutal. And I know last year Bernier really fell apart for a lot of the year, but he came back strong, or at least somewhat strong at the end of the year. And I think he should at least be in this list along with guys like Louis Domingue and, Jonas Enroth. I think that Jonathan Bernier belongs with that group.
I'll grant you that. I will. And he's also Randy Carlyle's former #1 goalie, so maybe that works for him. I do feel like Anaheim made their choice between Anderson and Gibson, and they're really going to push forward with it. I don't think they acquired Jonathan Bernier to just enter into another goaltending tandem situation. He's a top 30 goalie over the last 3 years in the NHL. If you're looking at even strength save percentage, which isn't great for a starter, is pretty decent for a backup situation, especially if you have a rookie facing a suddenly heavier workload than they've ever had in their career. So I think it's a good point. I could put him up there with those guys. The other guys that I had around Bernier in like my invisible tier 7, which is guys who I would put here for the sake of completion, of totality, of whatever word I'm looking for, but I don't believe in them quite as much as the guys I mentioned already. Scott Darling, Jonathan Bernier, Chad Johnson, Anders Nilsson in Buffalo. Chad Johnson's in Calgary, by the way. And then going even further, you've got Anton Khudobin in Boston, Darcy Kemper, Al Montoya in Montreal, if there's anything wrong with Price still. Mantis Armalis, or he's currently the #2 goalie on the depth chart in San Jose, but not necessarily the guy who will be the backup. And then you've got Antti Ranta in New York and Philip Grubauer in Washington, who will both be great if they get in the net. They're in great situations, but just don't know how often that's going to happen.
All right, man, you've talked about a lot of goalies. Hey, one guy you actually left out. You were saying that you were so concerned about Mrazek not necessarily having the job. Surprised you didn't have Jimmy Howard in that list, but I feel like that's actually a couple. But I think that's actually a Smörgoåliesbord tradition to always forget a Detroit goalie.
We've done it before. I think it was Jimmy Howard. We also forgot James Reimer one year. So just to be a total completist, that's the word I was looking for. Tier 8, the forget about him tier. Jimmy Howard, Jonas Gustafsson, Curtis McElhenney, Red O'Bara, Jeff Zatkoff, Keith Kincaid, Andrew Hammond, although maybe I'm not so sure. I think I want to bump him up to one of those invisible tier 7s. Jean-Francois Berube, Garrett Sparks, and Michael Hutchinson. And now I think we've named every goalie with a shot of seeing playing time in the NHL this year.
Okay, well, you didn't say Grubauer, but obviously he's going to play like 5 games for Washington.
I said him just above with Antti Ranta.
I think you skipped him. That's okay. All right.
Okay.
Brian, we've named all the goalies. Hopefully, the people listening to the show have enjoyed this. Thank you so much to everyone who joined us in the chat room. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks for all of your comments and all of your help. And again, yeah, everyone who stuck with us all throughout the summer, I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you liked this Smörgoåliesbord episode. Definitely tweeted us at Keeping Karlsson. Let us know where you think we got our tiers incorrect. We'd love to hear what you think. We could even retweet people who have an articulate argument for what we got wrong. And yeah,
Scott Wedgwood. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Scott Wedgwood is another goalie who could see a couple minutes in the NHL this year. Sorry, continue.
So what, he's on New Jersey?
Actually, he was. I don't actually have in front of me if he still is.
Yeah, he was on New Jersey, and then when Schneider got injured for a little bit, and then so it was Keith Kincaid that was the main guy, but then he didn't do so well, and then Wedgwood had a couple of good games. So that's so deep.
Yeah, I'm trying to quickly load. I don't know if he has a contract. I don't know what his situation is right now.
I wouldn't worry about it.
You know what? I'll include it in the credits.
Okay. How about this? Don't draft Scott Wedgwood, but do have fun in your drafts. Good luck. I know a lot of people have drafts coming up. Like I said, you could tweet at us, ask any questions you have, or you could consider becoming a patron of Keeping Karlsson, keepingkarlsson.com/patron to join our patron-only Facebook group. Also, by the way, we do have our Keeping Karlsson Ultimate Patron Fan Tracks League, which the deadline to sign up has passed, but we do still have a couple of open spots left. We have a wait list going, and we do have a couple spots. So if you're still interested in joining the couple, it might not be too late. So you could look into that. keepingkarlsson.com/patron. I'll stop mentioning it. Brian, what a fun show. I'm so excited to get to the hockey season already. We've got the World Cup coming, and so we'll talk about that on the next couple of episodes, I guess, if we're learning anything of fantasy relevance during that.
But next week, Elon, is our annual look at what new stats are going to help me win my fantasy hockey pool, where we go over a whole list of the stats that we use to make our fantasy decisions that you might not consider or might be a little, I'm not going to say afraid of. You're not afraid of anything, I'm sure, but a little confused by, shall we say. We're going to run down and simplify and make very good sense of all those interesting numbers.
Okay, so that'll be fun. That'll be the nerd episode where you log in if you want to be one of those people like some of our patrons who want to generate very complex charts and spreadsheets to determine who to draft. You'll need to learn about all the interesting advanced stats, but it's also useful because we're probably going to be referencing a lot of these stats. I remember last year in that annual episode, you brought up IPP, and then we ended up talking about that all throughout the year. That was a really interesting stat. By the way, there was a question in the chat room. Who's LA's backup? Yeah, a lot of teams, we're not sure who the backup is. It's Jeff Zatkoff, the former backup for Pittsburgh. So fun fact.
He was great in game 1 in the playoffs last year. Outstanding.
Was he?
Yeah, before he gave the net to Murray, he was actually the guy.
But was he outstanding?
He had an amazing game 1. I think it was game 1, if I'm remembering right. He was lauded everywhere. I think I tweeted about it. It was such a good start. But then I think he started falling apart in the second game. And I can't remember if he even got in at all for the third game. And then it was Matt Murray time.
Yeah, it should have been Matt Murray time the whole time. Anyways, okay, we're definitely rambling. So let's cue the outro music. And Brian, why don't you go ahead and read us the credits?
All right, this episode of the Keeping Karlsson Fantasy Hockey Podcast was presented by Dobber Hockey and supported by our patrons. It was researched with help from Dobber Hockey, Frozen Pool, Corsica, Hockey Analysis, Hockey Reference, Hockey Database, Ian Fleming's Blogspot site that we mentioned on the show on the bonus episode last week, Elite Prospects, Fantrax, and Roto World.
All right. Thanks, Brian. This has been so much fun. Thanks again to the fine people at Puck Tees for these super cool shirts. And we will be back with another episode next week about fancy stats.
Until then, keep on keeping Karlsson.
All right. Let us. Oh, bye.